Hey, welcome back. So this time I'm going to do something a little bit different. I didn't write a script, and I'm just going to do this build video kind of off the cuff. Hopefully I've done enough of these by now that I know what I'm talking about and don't miss anything, but I'll try to make sure I don't. So forgive any weird cuts or anything if that comes up. So the last week or two, I think I uploaded a video of a Talis surgical strikes build, kind of a vapor type, dogfighter type build. And I experimented a lot with this, and I tried it on a couple of different ships. The Terran Adamant Heavy Raider gets a honorable mention. The Adamant has an extra 15% crit severity because of the Raider ship mastery. But this Talis, you don't get that extra crit severity, but you do get an extra aft weapon slot. And I like the ship a little bit better, I guess, is the main reason why I flew it. So it's on the legendary Talis, but again, you could pretty much do the same type of build I'm going to describe here on any other full intel spec ship, because I'm using Surgical Strikes 3 as my main source of damage. And this is where I'm going to take a little bit of a sidetrack. I don't want to immediately convince you not to bother, but I just want to talk about some of the flaws with this type of build. So Surgical Strikes 3, let's talk about the pros. So Surgical Strikes 3, you get a large increase to damage, you get additional accuracy, a huge amount more crit chance and crit severity. You know, a lot more. So it seems at face value to be really, really good. But you are sacrificing a full command seat for it, which also limits the number of ships that could really do this type of build. Surgical Strikes 1 is not really that good by comparison. And I'll flash something up on the screen right now. This is a quick test, and this is a PvE test, so it's a little bit different. But someone in one of the DPS discords I'm in, figured this out. And you can see that Surgical Strikes 3 it's not a huge difference from Beam Overload 3 with Beam Banks. It is better, but unbuffed, it's only a minor difference. And then you think about how many traits and other things there are that increase beam overload damage that don't affect surgical strikes, and the gap starts to kind of get away, you know? So if you're not, maybe if you're missing some accuracy enhancing gear, or, you know, have some other ideas, you could definitely do a Surgical Strikes 3 build and it would be good. So it is effective. I'm not denying that. It's way better than it was before. You know, before we weren't even talking about Surgical Strikes because it was basically worthless. But it does have one critical problem, and that is when you activate Surgical Strikes, you can't activate any other beam or cannon abilities. It, you know, puts them all on a global cooldown. So what that means is these 4 proto-matter tactical consoles that are the main source of healing on a dogfighter build like this, you only get 1 activation now, Surgical Strikes, every 15 seconds, instead of 2 activations, because previously you would be cycling Beam Overload and a cannon ability. So basically you have half as much healing on a Surgical Strikes build, and the trade-off is that you do basically the same damage that you would have done if you just done Beam Overload 3. And you lose a commander seat that could have been, you know, Omega 3, or on a pilot ship, Clean Getaway 3, or Hold Together 3, or, you know, so many other great options for that seat. I'm hesitant to say that Surgical Strikes is the best option. So keep that in mind as we go through this build, that, you know, I'm a lot more fragile and, you know, kind of had to compensate for that with other things. It does have another advantage, though, and I'll talk about this. I have the Piezo Polaron Array and the Piezo Plasma Cannons. Both of these weapons have technical overload on them, But when you activate surgical strikes, if I hover over the tooltips here, you'll see technical overload damage is on the array, technical overload damage is on the cannons. If you are using both Polarons, like Polaron array and Polaron cannons, then whatever the first one to fire is, applies technical overload one time. But if you have them mismatched like this, one is plasma and one is Polaron, then the technical overload actually hits twice. One from each weapon, which is pretty awesome, but I'm not really sure it's worth the trade-off, but it's something. And then the other thing I was trying to make work on this build was the neutronic torpedo. The neutronic torpedo, it does a lot of damage, especially under high yield 3. Let me hover over that tooltip. 11,700 damage times 4, that's a huge hit. And a pretty large radiation damage burst as well. And since I'm running command spec anyway for the boost morale, last time I flew this, it was still evade target lock craziness, even though that patch just dropped to fix it. But I'm still going to run command spec, and if it happens that I get the 100 armor pen against exposed targets from command spec, then that could be a massive, massive damage hit, in theory. And I guess that's the next thing to just jump straight into, is I'll bring up my combat meter. So this is the parse, the combat log from the match that I uploaded earlier in this ship. And shout out to my friend Brandon here, who is no longer with us and had an absolutely amazing send-off in his last match ever in Star Trek Online. He'll be sorely missed. Anyway, if I bring up the combat analysis reports and I go to my name, let's just take a look at something. So myself and Matt Duty were both on the same team here, and we both had pretty similar performances. And he is in a beam overload dogfighter build, so he's a really, really good basis for comparison. So I'm gonna show that here. So if you look at my abilities, my technical overload hit 99 times, and let's just compare just the wide angle disruptor. Now, the important thing when looking at a parse for PvP is we're not looking at DPS, we're not looking at total damage, or even max one hit necessarily, okay? The only thing that matters is how much damage you actually deal to enemy players, okay? If I fly in and I just demolish somebody's photonic pet or something, it doesn't matter. You know, like, I mean, that there's still some value to cleaning up pets. I'm not saying that, but it's not the same as dealing damage to enemy players. So if I change it to damage 2, we can look at my individual damage abilities, and then here are the enemy players, including some friendly fire. Sorry, Matt. But here are the enemy players, and you can see how much damage I dealt to them. And this is with all weapons. So if I go and look at the wide-angle dual heavy beam bank with Surgical Strikes 3, you can see the damage that I'm dealing to each person. I had some one-hits in the 36. I had a nice big one-hit here, 49k. That's pretty good. And pretty low hit rates. You know, I need higher accuracy on this build. And then the crit percentage is bugged because the crit records twice if they have temporary hull. So, like Baroness here probably didn't have temporary hull. 75% crit chance is what I'm actually getting. T'Challa had temporary hull, so it's recording it twice. So I guess you take that value and divide it roughly in half-ish. But obviously when I deal damage and he has no temporary hull, then it's not totally accurate. So it's kind of a mess. But and let me look at, just for giggles, technical overload. So technical overload, wow, 80,000 technical overload hit on Baroness. That's awesome. But then, you know, 57,000 on these other two, and only 40,000 on Beebs here. But now let's just do a quick comparison to Matt Duty's build, which is Beam Overload 3. And we'll look at the same wide-angle dual heavy beam bank under Overload 3. And if you look, his damage average is actually higher than mine, with similar accuracy and crit rates. So he's dealing more damage with Beam Overload 3 than I'm dealing with Surgical Strikes 3, and he has double the healing that I have from the Colony consoles. And I go look at Technical Overload, and it's all over the place, but 57k on this guy, and then one big one on Rena, 77k. I mean, that's roughly the same that I was doing. And the only difference is that his Technical Overload is exactly half as often, 50 times, versus mine going off 99 times. So, yes, I'm dealing more Technical Overload damage, but the actual damage that I'm dealing to enemy players with Surgical Strikes is not higher than if I just use Beam Overload 3. And then if I look at the Neutronic Torpedo, I've got a couple of big hits here, but again, let's go to damage 2. We'll find my Neutronic Torpedo, heavy 3, 12k, 19k, 25k. This is a decently big hit, but it's not a lot. It's really not a lot of damage, and it's mostly shield damage. A little bit of hole penetrating on these guys, but if you watch that match back, there's like a rare occasion where somebody gets held or locked down in place or something, and I land that torpedo hit, and it looks really awesome. There we go. But most of the time, it's barely doing anything. The spread actually seemed to do almost more damage, which is kind of funny. And under spread, it just fires one torpedo, but it deals more damage. 21,000 kinetic damage times 1 per target. So yeah, you hit multiple targets, but the hit is actually bigger instead of firing multiple torpedoes. Kind of interesting with the Neutronic. And then there's the radiation burst, but it's not a lot. It's there, but it's not a lot. Anyway, long story short, it was a fun idea, the double technical overloads and the Neutronic Torpedo. And I definitely think it's cool, but there's just too many sacrifices. But anyway, I probably deterred you from even trying this build, but I'm going to go through it anyway. So, like I said, for my weapons, I've already got the mismatched PZO weapons, Disruptor Wide Angle Dual Heavy Beam Bank, and I have an Ology Disruptor here, but maybe the Terran Task Force Disruptor Array might have been a better choice there. And then I had the Neutronic Torpedo Launcher. I'm using the Fleet Deflector for the most amount of crit, and the 3-piece competitive set, same that I usually run just for more energy resistance. In the rear, I have the Martok Omni and a crafted Disruptor Omni. And my experimental weapon is the Graviton Implosion Charges, which deals quite a bit of kinetic damage and has a damage resistance debuff as well, so that's a really good one, especially when you can knock somebody's shield facing down really fast with like Technical Overload or whatever. I have the 2-piece with the Wide Angle Dual Beam Bank, so Lorca's is here. The 2-piece of the Martok is here. And then I have Bioneural Infusion for more crit severity, the Ultimate Swarm Processor for more accuracy and crit chance. And then the next 4 consoles in Science are all defensive, because I was really worried about having just these 4 colony consoles for healing. So I have the Protomatter Field Projector, Elachi Rift Jump to get out of Psi Spam, DPRM, which I use basically for the 500% hull regen, and then Impulse Capacitance Cell, which pretty much shoots you across the map with a huge flight speed boost. And you can cancel it partway through, so it's useful in a way, but it pretty much takes you out of the fight and you leave your team out to dry. So I'm not really sure I can really recommend that. My skill tree, I was running Command as primary and Strategist as secondary. And the reason I'm running Strategist as secondary is a couple of times I turn off Threatening Stance to get the extra 20% crit severity, because I was really trying to squeeze out any crit severity I could, especially with the surgical strikes. As for traits, I've got Pseudo Submission. That is my main placate. Fragment of AI Tech, and the reason that's there, not only for the control expertise, but the energy weapon damage based on control expertise. This increases the damage from technical overload as well. So for example, if I hit technical overload here, it's 17,000. If I take this trait off, drops down to 16,000 some. It's a minor boost, but still nice to have. Then I have Fresh from R&R. That's just for faster team cooldowns, always good to have. Terran Targeting Systems, that's a nice big crit severity boost. Give Your All, that dodges incoming damage for a few seconds. Intelligence Agent Attaché, that's for getting my attack pattern alpha and tactical fleet and my other captain abilities up off a cooldown faster. Context is for Kings, that's damage resistance and bonus damage. Reconstructive Radiation, which I'm mainly using for the healing. I'm not using any temporary hull in this build. I don't have hull image refractors, so it's okay to stack up several sources of healing. Good Day to Die, that's because I'm a tactical captain. I can use Go Down Fighting at any hull level. That's 50% bonus damage, which is pretty nice to have, and a really fast cooldown, so helps with that big spike damage. And Self-Modulating Fire, and part of the reason behind this is that 50% shield penetration works even with projectile weapons, and I was really trying to make that neutronic torpedo be a heavy hitter. I'm not really sure if I really pulled it off. Then for my starship traits, I have Vanguard Specialists. This extends the duration of surgical strikes to last the full 15 seconds. And it does have a 15-second global cooldown, so that's 100% uptime on surgical strikes. I'm using Assault Formation Theta because I'm also using attack pattern Omega 1. And basically that grants a pretty big, this weapon amplification, that equates to, I think it's 64% more crit severity, and gives me a high yield 3. Again, for the neutronic torpedo, I thought that would be cool. And it comes on this ship anyway, so I don't think, like if I were doing it on the Adamant, Terran Adamant Raider, I don't think I would use this trait. I think I would use something else. And then to try to make up for some of the healing loss, I'm using Concealed Repairs. And the reason I'm using Concealed Repairs, and this will be an interesting one to break down, Concealed Repairs gives you 33% of your ship's hull over 10 seconds. So let me just bring up my calculator. I have 117,000 hull. And it would be higher with a Threatening Stance on, which I flip on and off as I use this build. But even at 117,000, if I take 33% of that and divide it by 10 seconds, that's healing me 3,800 every second for a grand total of 38,000 hull. The alternative to Concealed Repairs usually is Plot Armor. But if I pull that up, since I'm not boosting Plot Armor with anything, I don't have any healing increase consoles or anything, it's 40,000 over duration, so the size is actually smaller. In this case, it's pretty close, because it'd be 40,000 divided by 15 seconds. So it's a smaller stack, but the actual total is roughly the same. And it also grants some damage resistance and removes hazard debuffs. Honestly, I think now that I look at it, on this build, I probably should have used Plot Armor instead of Concealed Repairs. But considering Plot Armor is a extremely expensive bundle trait or a promo ship, and Concealed Repairs performs almost exactly as well, it's kind of difficult to recommend using Plot Armor, especially if you're on a tight budget. And one other thing about concealed repairs that's kind of interesting, pseudo submission, right? It placates all foes that have you targeted. So, and I've had this happen before. I'll actually post a clip up of this happening. A bunch of pets were targeting me, and pseudo submission went off, and I got 34 stacks of concealed repairs because you can get it more than once. So it has a 45-second lockout, but if you placate multiple enemies in the same, motion, then it actually stacks, which is really crazy. So if I take that 38 610 hull that I have and I multiply it, I think I got like 34 stacks. That's 1.3 million in heal. I mean, that's such a ridiculous amount of healing that you're basically unkillable for 10 seconds. So concealed repairs is, considering you can grab it on the exchange for like 1 million EC, if you don't have this, go get it now. I'm just saying. So, and then I'm using Rhythmic Rumble to have some more resist and lower my weapon power cost. This is, of course, using Aux to Damp on a full intel ship. Now that Evade Target Lock isn't a thing anymore, you could use Aux to Sif instead again, but Rhythmic Rumble then requires you to have a pilot seat. And the only ship in the game right now that can do full intel and pilot is the Saturn science vessel. So if you want to do a Surgical Strikes build with pilot, the Saturn is your only choice. I actually had one, but I never unboxed it and I ended up selling it. I'd love to do a build on it. I just couldn't justify the cost at the time and I needed other stuff. But somebody should do that, post a video, because I think that'd be really cool, like a giant, hollow disc of terror. Anyway, if I ditched Rhythmic Rumble, I'd be pretty worried about weapon power cost, but luckily Surgical Strikes doesn't have the same weapon power cost increase that Beam Overload does, so it's not quite as bad. Something to consider. And then I have Zal, of course, the invincible trait, good to have, and Carrier Wave Shield Hacking, and the reason for that is I'm also using Evade Target Lock 2 on this build, which I am not really using for the disable. It's mostly there to disable shields. So my idea basically was to hit all these buffs ahead of time on this row at 5 at the top, and get all my captain abilities all buffed up. Surgical Strikes is just always on because it's cycling, and then as I fly up to attack someone, I hit them with Evade Target Lock, which then disables them and their shields for a split second, and I land a couple of big hits with Surgical Strikes and the Neutronic Torpedo. That was kind of the idea behind the build. It's kind of questionable how well it worked, but it was a fun change of pace. For Starship or Space traits, I have Advanced Hull Reinforcement, that's bonus damage, Advanced Targeting for more crit severity, Counter Stroke, which gives you a ton more crit severity when affected by a control. So the nice thing about that is you can fly just sort of near a gravity well, and if it even touches you at all, you get this huge crit severity boost, so you can use that to really lay into people with a big severity boost. Automated Protomatter Conduits, I like this trait a lot, it's really good. Basically 50% uptime, huge hull regen and shield heal. And since I'm not using temporary hull, I get a lot from this. And Viral Engine Overload, which disables the engines of enemies, especially somebody else that's also running Rhythmic Rumble. If I can knock their engines off for a second or two, and they don't clear it, that could be the window to land a really big hit. Onto the Bridge Officer Station, so let's start with the Tactical Seat. I've got Surgical Strikes 3, like I said before. Omega 3, that gives me more speed, more defense, immunity to being disabled, and movement debuffs. Since I don't have Pilot Team, that's really nice to have for getting out of like Gravity Wells and Chronoton Torpedoes and Plasma Storms and all the other slows and other debilitating effects. And it happens to work really well with the trait that I have, the Theta one for the high yield torpedoes, but obviously if you don't have that trait, You don't have to run Omega. You could run something else here. I just thought it worked really well with this build. Evade Target Lock 2, that's pretty much just there for the carrier wave shield hacking. Intelligence team, more perception and more self-stealth. Never hurts. In my other universal seat, this Ensign Universal, I have another tactical seat which has spread 1, and I was trying to alternate between spread and high yield. I normally would never do that. I would tell pretty much anyone to pick one, either spread or high yield, in the same way I tell people in PvE to pick either beam overload or fire at will, not both, that kind of thing. But the spread just, it deals so much damage on that single hit, and the radiation damage that it does is higher as well. I really just wanted to see which would do more damage on the parse, and the answer was that they kind of evened out. So I think if I weren't using spread, or if I weren't using a torpedo, I might swap this for like tac team, just to have that extra immunity to evade target lock or whatever. Or maybe chemosite lace weaponry 1. That'd be a good one to put in there. Some more radiation damage and all that. And the torpedo will always trigger chemosite, which is good. My engineering seats, I've got engines 3 rotating with shields 1. I also could do engines 1 and like emergency to aux 3, which would get me more perception and more stealth. But I was trying not to stay in combat for too long. Aux to dampers 1 for obvious reasons. Engineering team 1, that's to clear debuffs like viral engines or whatever. Reverse shield polarity 1, just another, get out of trouble button. I'm using Photonic Officer 2 to make sure I have the best possible cooldowns. Tractor Beam Repulsors 1, and I have that right here on my bar, and it's pretty much purely for the purpose of breaking out of parasitic ice. Not really any other reason behind that one. And then Science Team clears subnucleonic beam and any other science debuffs like spore-infused anomalies, Tychon's Rift, whatever. Duty officers. So I've got this officer that removes 3 random buffs from your target. This officer used to be super overpowered like 10 years ago. That 1% chance to remove, it removed all buffs, like a subnucleonic beam instead of just 3 random ones. This one, it only removes 3 random ones, but it doesn't get cleared by Science Team or whatever. So if it works, and you're lucky enough to clear, Rhythmic Rumble or Plot Armor or, something good, it could be pretty good. But it's, one of those, like, you're hoping for that 1 in a million chance, 1 in 100 chance, I guess, that it happens to proc. And then also that the 3 buffs it takes are the good ones. But just thought I'd try it out in this build. And then I have 20 and 47, that's for more accuracy. I'm not getting the pilot armor penetration for this because I don't have pilot seat. So maybe like a crit severity one would be better, but I'm too poor to buy 27 and 47 or whatever the fancy severity ones are. But I am running a crit severity energy weapons duty officer to get that extra 30% when it works. And then the evasive maneuvers duty officer, because it's always good to have that speed at the ready. I have an Oxidamp Extend stuff. I'm using a purple because I got it years ago when they were cheap. You could use a blue and it's fine. It's not really a big difference. If I were using Oxysif, I would use the Placate officer instead. And the last one's a Warp Core Engineer. Chance to remove all debuffs when using your emergency power abilities. That's a really, really good one to have, because by all debuffs, so far I've tested a lot of them, it really means all debuffs. I've had it clear subnucleonic beam off of me and stuff and save me from dying before, so slam dunk. Use this stuff on everything if you can get them. And there's a blue and a green variant as well that are almost as good. So, and just, I wanted to show also what Impulse Burst Capacitor looks like. The impulse burst capacitor, if I hover over my speed here, and this isn't even the fastest ship I've done, if I wait for that competitive engine to go off again, here in just 5 seconds, and I hit impulse burst capacitor, I can get some crazy, crazy speed. Here we go. 1500 something, 1600. And then I can cancel it early and turn around. I mean, look how far from Deep Space Nine I am already. 130 kilometers. Anyway, it's a funny console, and it does get you out of trouble quickly, but, you know, it'd be pretty stupid to do that in PvP and just fly away from your team and leave them short-handed, but it's entertaining, you know, and why are we playing PvP if it's not for the entertainment? So, anyway, that's the build, and again, I'm still not, you know, 100% sold on surgical strikes. It's got a lot of drawbacks, but you know, it can be made usable, and as long as you have good enough healing to survive. I mean, a lot of it's also going to depend on who you're playing against. You know, I'm mostly playing against endgame PvPers at this point, so you got to be really, really prepared. If I took this same build into the Arena Endeavor, or if I was just playing amongst, you know, some fleet mates or casual players, or somewhere where there's I hear that on console there's a wider skill gap, so a build like this might perform better on console, for example, than it does here on PC. So there you go. Thanks for watching.